Tonight, harrowing video showing a woman frantically running away from federal agents in Louisiana as President Trump's nationwide immigration crackdown intensifies.
Leave me alone!
Masked border agents chasing that woman on foot as she screams in fear.
Hey, so who you looking for?
Running into her house as her stepfather races outside, initially thinking she was being kidnapped, demanding answers. That woman was a 23-year-old U.S. citizen. DHS saying in a statement, all agents left the area as soon as they determined the individual in question was not who they were looking for. That incident comes after federal agents pulled this woman out of a car during a border operation in Florida as she screamed she was a U.S. citizen.
I'm a U.S. citizen! Please help me! This is unfair! Why are you doing this to me?
Authorities placing her in handcuffs, briefly detaining her. Officials say.
Watch that footage again and let the horror of what you just witnessed seep into your bones, because this is not some dystopian nightmare projected onto a screen for entertainment value. This is the lived reality of American citizens in 2025, under a regime that has weaponized federal law enforcement against brown bodies with such brazen impunity that even the pretense of constitutional restraint has evaporated into the ether. And I need you to understand something fundamental here before we go any further into this abyss. Something that will make your blood run cold when you realize the implications. What's happening is that the Latino community, especially those with darker skin, maybe that speak Spanish, listen to Spanish music, we are being racially profiled, and this isn't some isolated incident or bureaucratic mistake that can be chalked up to the fog of war and immigration enforcement. This is systemic terror deployed with military precision against communities of color, while the Department of Homeland Security issues sanitized press releases claiming they're only targeting dangerous criminals when more than 80% of the immigrants arrested in D.C. during the surge in federal law enforcement this year had no prior criminal record. Newly released federal data shows, even though that crackdown was portrayed as targeting violent crime. You heard that woman screaming, didn't you? You heard the raw primal terror in her voice as she ran from federal agents who were hunting her through the streets of Louisiana like she was prey, like she was something less than human, and the fact that she turned out to be a 23-year-old United States citizen should detonate like a bomb in your consciousness, because it exposes the rotten core of what this administration has constructed, which is nothing less than a racialized police state, where your constitutional rights evaporate the moment your skin is the wrong shade, or you speak the wrong language, or you happen to be in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. This is Hannah Arendt's banality of evil manifested in khaki uniforms and tactical gear. This is what happens when fascistic impulses are given the full backing of federal authority, and the Supreme Court itself greenlights racial profiling by lifting protections that prevented ICE from targeting people based on appearance and language. Because yes, the September Supreme Court decision, Noem v. Vasquez Perdomo, lifted an order that had stopped ICE from targeting people based on race, language, and place of work, and the Supreme Court decision has allowed ICE to use broad criteria when making stops, including the type of location at which they were found, the type of job they appeared to work, whether they speak Spanish or English with an accent, and their apparent race or ethnicity. Do you understand what that means in practice? What it looks like when judicial sanction is given to the kind of racialized enforcement that we thought we had relegated to the dustbin of history alongside Jim Crow and the Chinese Exclusion Act? It means that dozens, if not hundreds, of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents had been detained or arrested, and sometimes held for days. It means that a man named Javier Ramirez can be working at an auto junkyard when masked Border Patrol agents storm in and tackle him, and arrest him and hold him for more than 4 days on fabricated charges of assaulting a federal officer, charges that were later dropped because Ramirez believes agents fabricated it to cover up for racially profiling him, and this pattern repeats itself across the country in city after city, where fearing an encounter with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol, or one of several other federal agencies involved in the crackdowns, many migrants retreated into isolation, local businesses felt the blow as workers stayed home, and classroom seats sat empty as immigrant parents dared not drive their kids to school. But wait, because it gets worse. So much worse that you need to brace yourself for what I'm about to tell you, because on the first school day after immigration agents flooded into Charlotte, more than 30,000 students, about 20% of district enrollment, were absent from Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And when a fifth of all students are too terrified to go to school, because federal agents are conducting military-style operations in their neighborhoods, when parents are making the agonizing calculation that their child's safety matters more than their education, when entire communities are forced into hiding like resistance fighters in occupied territory, then we have crossed a threshold that should alarm every single person who claims to care about democracy and human rights, and the fundamental dignity that is supposed to be guaranteed to all people, regardless of their documentation status. The historical parallels here are not subtle, and they are not hyperbolic, because we have seen this before. We have seen what happens when state power is marshaled to dehumanize and terrorize entire populations based on immutable characteristics. We have seen the roundups and the raids and the camps and the trains, and while I am not saying we are at that endpoint yet, I am saying with absolute clarity that the mechanisms are being constructed right now, the legal architecture is being erected brick by brick, and the normalization of what should be shocking is happening at a pace that should terrify anyone with even a cursory understanding of 20th century history. Michel Foucault taught us about the carceral archipelago, about how state power operates through surveillance and punishment, and the creation of docile bodies, and Giorgio Agamben warned us about states of exception where the rule of law is suspended in the name of security, creating zones where human beings are reduced to what he called bare life, stripped of political and legal standing, and that is precisely what we are witnessing in real time as Trump's mass deportation campaign has garnered attention for its heavy-handed arrest tactics of undocumented immigrants nationwide, and the administration's steady drumbeat of incremental changes to the U.S. immigration system has also been disruptive, gumming up an already arduous process for millions of people. Now I want you to think about the second woman in that clip, the one being pulled from the car screaming that she's a U.S. citizen, begging for help, asking why this is happening to her, and the official justification is that she was driving her undocumented boyfriend's car and initially refused to identify herself, as if that somehow justifies the traumatizing spectacle of federal agents forcibly removing a citizen from a vehicle and placing her in handcuffs, and I need you to recognize this for what it is, which is collective punishment, which is the terrorizing of entire communities to enforce compliance with a brutal deportation regime that has now explicitly abandoned any pretense that it's focused on criminals or threats to public safety. The administration keeps repeating the lie that they're targeting the worst of the worst, but the Trump administration promised to deport the worst of the worst criminal immigrants, but is now detaining undocumented workers with no serious criminal record, and this gap between rhetoric and reality is not an accident or a mistake, it is the core strategy, because the point is not actually public safety, the point is terror. The point is to make life so unbearable for immigrant communities, and anyone who looks like they might be part of those communities, that they either self-deport or live in such constant fear that they become invisible, silent, politically neutered. And here's the bombshell that should make your head explode with rage. A federal judge raised this concern, writing, "If today the executive claims the right to deport without due process and in disregard of court orders, what assurance will there be tomorrow that it will not deport American citizens and then disclaim responsibility to bring them home? And what assurance shall there be that the executive will not train its broad discretionary powers upon its political enemies?" Do you hear what that judge is saying? Do you understand the constitutional precipice we are teetering on when a federal jurist has to explicitly warn that the administration's disregard for legal constraints could lead to the deportation of citizens themselves, when the machinery of state repression has been so thoroughly unleashed that even citizens are not safe if they have the wrong skin color or speak the wrong language? This is authoritarianism, full stop. This is what creeping fascism looks like when it's dressed up in the language of law and order and border security, and the intellectual dishonesty of conservative defenses of these policies would be laughable if the consequences weren't so catastrophic for real human beings. They'll tell you that immigration enforcement is necessary, that borders matter, that national sovereignty requires strict controls, and fine, let's even grant some version of that argument for the sake of discussion. But none of that, absolutely none of it, justifies the kind of racialized dragnet that is sweeping up citizens and terrorizing entire neighborhoods and forcing children to stay home from school in fear. The Fourth Amendment exists precisely to prevent this kind of unreasonable search and seizure. The Equal Protection Clause exists precisely to prevent this kind of discriminatory enforcement. And yet, the plaintiffs had established a substantial likelihood of an unlawful policy and practice by defendants of conducting warrantless civil immigration arrests without probable cause, according to multiple federal judges, who have had to step in and impose injunctions to try to rein in this runaway enforcement apparatus. Think about the surveillance state that has been activated here. Think about the way that Chad Curry eyes passing vehicles with a skepticism he didn't have just a few months ago, knowing to carefully clock whether a passing car has darkly tinted windows, out-of-state license plates, or even no plates at all, and some models like Chevy Tahoes, Dodge Chargers, Ford Explorers give him extra pause, because those are the vehicles that federal agents use when they're conducting their raids. This is what it means to live under occupation. This is what it means when the government has made it clear that your body is subject to seizure at any moment based on nothing more than your appearance, and the psychological toll of this kind of ambient terror cannot be overstated. The way it corrodes trust in institutions, the way it forces people into defensive postures, the way it creates exactly the kind of fractured, atomized society that authoritarian regimes thrive upon. And the legal resistance to this is being mounted, thank God, with organizations like the ACLU and immigrant rights groups filing lawsuits and documenting the abuses and demanding accountability. And there have been some victories, some judges who have looked at the evidence and said, no, this violates the Constitution, you cannot do this. U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell in Washington granted a preliminary injunction sought by civil liberties and immigrants' rights groups in a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, saying the plaintiffs had established a substantial likelihood of an unlawful policy and practice by defendants of conducting warrantless civil immigration arrests without probable cause, but these legal victories are precarious and under constant assault from an administration that views judicial oversight as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a constitutional check to be respected. What we're seeing is the construction of a two-tiered system of rights, where citizenship itself no longer guarantees protection from arbitrary state violence if you happen to be Latino or speak Spanish or live in the wrong neighborhood, and this should concern everyone, not just those who are directly targeted, because the logic of authoritarian power is always expansive, it always seeks new targets, it always pushes boundaries, and what starts with raids on immigrant communities will not stay contained there, if history is any guide. An advocacy group said they're trying to use terrorism laws to attack people for their speech and for their political activism, and that's an authoritarian effort. And indeed, Trump's team also has questioned the legality of civic groups providing immigrants with Know Your Rights trainings on how to respond to federal agents, with border czar Tom Homan suggesting that such seminars help people evade law enforcement, which tells you everything you need to know about the administration's contempt for civil liberties and the rule of law, because if teaching people about their constitutional rights is somehow construed as obstruction of justice, then we have entered a realm where the Constitution itself is viewed as an impediment to the exercise of raw power. The media has a responsibility here that it is largely failing to meet, because too many outlets are treating this as a policy debate rather than a human rights crisis. They're platforming administration officials who spew lies about targeting criminals when the data clearly shows otherwise. They're using sanitizing language like immigration enforcement and deportation operations, when what we're actually talking about is terrorizing communities and separating families and traumatizing children and violating constitutional rights on a massive scale. Call it what it is, this is ethnic cleansing logic. This is the attempt to make the United States inhospitable to anyone who doesn't fit a narrow white nationalist vision of who belongs here, and the fact that some of the people being swept up are citizens just exposes the racial animus at the core of the entire enterprise. And let's talk about the Supreme Court's complicity in this nightmare, because the court judgment reversed judgments from two lower courts in Vasquez-Perdomo v. Noem that barred immigration agents from stopping individuals without reasonable suspicion, and from relying solely on 4 factors including apparent race or ethnicity, speaking Spanish or English with an accent, presence in a particular location like a bus stop, car wash or agricultural site, or the type of work a person does, with one advocate saying today's decision effectively greenlights racial profiling. This is the same court that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that overturned Roe v. Wade, that has systematically dismantled civil rights protections in service of a reactionary political agenda, and now they have given federal agents the explicit authority to engage in racial profiling, to stop people based on how they look and how they speak and where they work, which is precisely the kind of discriminatory enforcement that the Fourth Amendment and Equal Protection Clause were designed to prevent. The economic impact of this terror campaign is devastating entire communities, because local businesses felt the blow as workers stayed home. And when you force people into hiding, when you make them too afraid to go to work or shop or participate in economic life, you're not just destroying individual lives, you're destroying the fabric of entire neighborhoods and cities. But of course the cruelty is the point. The economic devastation is a feature, not a bug, because the goal is to make life so untenable that people leave, that they either self-deport or are so terrorized that they become invisible. And this strategy has historical precedents in ethnic cleansing campaigns around the world, where economic destruction is used as a tool of population removal. Now let me tell you about the community resistance that is emerging, because thousands of parents, teachers, clergy, and community organizers have sought training on what they can legally do when they see an immigration raid unfold. People are forming ICE Watch patrols to document enforcement actions. They're creating rapid response networks, They're providing legal support and know your rights training, and this is exactly the kind of solidarity and collective action that is necessary to resist authoritarian encroachment, because when the state abandons any pretense of protecting the rights of all people, then communities have to protect themselves and each other. The goal of the patrols is not to interfere with an ongoing arrest, but to create accountability for agents, with organizers saying, "We think that ICE agents don't act with as much brutality or impunity if they know they're being recorded, and they know they're being watched, and this is people power in action. This is what democracy looks like from below, when the institutions that are supposed to protect rights have been captured by authoritarians." But the Trump administration's response to this grassroots resistance has been to double down on repression, with Louisiana passing a law that makes it a crime to interfere with immigration enforcement, which is such a broad and vague standard that it could criminalize everything from documenting raids to providing legal support to simply speaking out against enforcement actions. And Trump's team has questioned the legality of civic groups providing immigrants with Know Your Rights trainings, with Border Czar Tom Homan suggesting that such seminars help people evade law enforcement, with an advocacy group saying they're trying to use terrorism laws to attack people for their speech and for their political activism, and that's an authoritarian effort. This is textbook authoritarianism, the attempt to criminalize dissent and resistance, to isolate vulnerable populations by making it illegal for anyone to help them understand or assert their rights, and it should set off every alarm bell for anyone who understands how authoritarianism works, how it targets not just the primary victims, but also anyone who shows solidarity with them, to systematically dismantling the networks of mutual aid and resistance that might challenge state power. The educational system is being devastated by this as well, because when students are too afraid to go to school, when one teacher reported that 10 out of 31 students in a multilingual classroom had developed significant attendance issues, and a 2025 Stanford University working paper found that immigration raids in California led to a 22% increase in daily student absences, then we are creating a generation of children who are being traumatized and whose education is being stolen from them because of their parents' immigration status or their family's ethnicity. The long-term consequences of this cannot be overstated. The way that trauma in childhood shapes brain development and life outcomes, the way that educational disruption compounds disadvantage, the way that terrorizing children creates cycles of trauma that ripple forward through generations. And I need you to understand the broader context here, because Trump's latest immigration crackdown means he has now halted or tightened every form of foreign entry into the U.S., with Trump's mass deportation campaign garnering attention for its heavy-handed arrest tactics, while the administration's steady drumbeat of incremental changes to the U.S. immigration system has also been disruptive, gumming up an already arduous process for millions of people. This is not just about undocumented immigration. This is about closing off the United States to the world, about constructing a fortress America that reflects a white nationalist vision of who deserves to be here, and it's being done through executive orders and administrative changes and enforcement actions that bypass Congress and often the courts, concentrating power in the executive branch in ways that should alarm anyone who understands how authoritarian consolidation works. The comparison to historical atrocities is not hyperbolic when we look at the mechanisms being deployed here. The way that a reporter wondered as a student of history, when we hear about atrocities of the past, when we learn about them in school, what were people doing at the time? Because that's the question we will have to answer to future generations when they ask us what we did when federal agents were hunting citizens in the streets, when children were too afraid to go to school, when entire communities were forced into hiding, when the Constitution was being shredded in the name of immigration enforcement. We can see it happening, we can document it, we have the receipts, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to resist? How are we going to build the movements and the solidarity and the political power necessary to stop this before it metastasizes into something even more horrific? The legal scholar Michael Klarman talks about how constitutional rights are often most vulnerable, precisely when they're needed most, during times of perceived crisis, when fear can be weaponized to erode protections. And that's exactly what's happening here, as the administration uses the pretext of immigration enforcement to construct a surveillance and detention apparatus that threatens everyone's liberty. The infrastructure being built right now, the databases and the surveillance systems and the detention facilities and the coordination between federal and local law enforcement, all of this will persist regardless of who the targets are today. It will be available to be deployed against whoever the state deems undesirable tomorrow, and that should concern every single person regardless of their immigration status or ethnicity or political affiliation. Now let's talk about the explicit lying that the Department of Homeland Security engages in when confronted with evidence of abuse, because the Department of Homeland Security said allegations that its agents racially profile are, quote, disgusting, reckless, and categorically false, even as a lawyer represents 10 other U.S. citizens or green card holders who've been arrested or detained by immigration agents, with each seeking $1 million in damages from the federal government, and even as multiple federal judges have found substantial evidence of systematic constitutional violations. This is gaslighting on a massive scale, the attempt to make people doubt the evidence of their own eyes and ears, to delegitimize the testimony of victims and the findings of courts, and it's a classic authoritarian tactic, the big lie told with such brazen confidence that it creates a fog of unreality, where truth itself becomes contested. The worksite raids are another dimension of this terror campaign, because who Border Patrol has been arresting in these operations has garnered controversy, with agents depicted on video smashing car windows and arresting day laborers and other workers during roving patrols at Home Depot parking lots and other locations, and again we see the targeting of people based on where they work and what they look like, rather than any individualized suspicion of wrongdoing. Workers reported that ICE agents targeted Latino employees, subjecting them to racial slurs, physical force, and prolonged detention, while white workers were allowed to remain free, with reports indicating that ICE used race or ethnicity to identify unauthorized workers during raids, and that agents handcuffed all employees presumed to be Latino until their immigration status could be verified. This is racial profiling as official policy. This is the state explicitly using race as a proxy for immigration status, and the fact that citizens are being swept up in these dragnets just proves that it's not actually about immigration status at all, it's about targeting brown bodies. And the gutting of internal oversight mechanisms makes all of this worse, because former oversight employees say they played a critical role to avoid civil rights violations in immigration enforcement, looking at whether law enforcement agencies partnered with ICE were following protocols and not using the program to racially profile individuals or to go outside the bounds of what the agreement with ICE was in regard to civil liberties and civil rights, but a former employee of DHS's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties said this massive infusion of funds to ICE is super problematic, and warned that more people are going to die in custody as a result, because there are not going to be the same level of checks and balances internally, and the American public will not be able to be as outraged because there's no one with whom to file these complaints. So the administration has systematically dismantled the internal mechanisms that were supposed to prevent abuse, has fired the people whose job it was to ensure constitutional compliance, and has done so precisely at the moment when enforcement is being ramped up to unprecedented levels, which tells you everything about their intent. This is organized state violence. This is what it looks like when the apparatus of government is turned against specific populations with the explicit purpose of terrorizing them into submission or departure, and the fact that it's being done in the name of law enforcement doesn't make it legitimate. It makes it more dangerous because it cloaks brutality in the language of legality. It gives people permission to look away or to tell themselves that there must be a good reason, that these people must have done something wrong, that the government wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't necessary. But that's the insidious nature of authoritarian logic, the way it invites us to dehumanize the targets of state violence, to tell ourselves that they're criminals or threats, or that they somehow brought this on themselves, when the reality is that the vast majority of people being arrested have no criminal record, and the real crime here is the systematic violation of constitutional rights by the government itself. We need to be building mass movements right now. We need to be in the streets and in the courts and in the halls of power, demanding an end to this, demanding accountability for the agents and officials who are violating the Constitution, demanding the dismantling of the infrastructure of deportation and detention that has been constructed over decades and that has reached crisis levels under this administration. We need sanctuary cities and states that will refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. We need legal defense funds and rapid response networks. We need media coverage that tells the truth about what's happening, rather than sanitizing it with euphemistic language. We need political leadership that will stand up and say categorically that this is wrong, that this is un-American, that this cannot be allowed to continue. And we need to connect this fight to the broader struggle for racial and economic justice, because the forces that want to terrorize immigrant communities are the same forces that want to gut the social safety net, and suppress voting rights and criminalize poverty, and dismantle labor unions, and concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a tiny elite. This is all connected. This is all part of the same project of creating a society where a small minority can dominate and exploit everyone else, and the way you do that is by dividing working people against each other, along racial and ethnic and national lines, by creating scapegoats and directing anger downward toward the most vulnerable, rather than upward toward the people who actually have power. Immigration enforcement is a tool of class warfare and racial domination, and we have to understand it as such if we're going to build movements powerful enough to defeat it. So when you watch that footage of a woman running in terror from federal agents, when you hear her screaming for them to leave her alone, when you see the second woman being dragged from a car while she begs for help, do not look away. Do not tell yourself that this is unfortunate but necessary. Do not let the administration's lies about targeting criminals deceive you into thinking that this is anything other than what it is, which is systematic racialized state violence deployed against communities of color in service of a white nationalist political project. This is the reality of Trump's immigration crackdown. This is what it looks like on the ground when you strip away the sanitizing rhetoric, and all of us have a responsibility to bear witness and to resist and to build the kind of solidarity and collective power that can stop this machine before it grinds more lives into dust. The question is whether we will meet that responsibility, or whether we will be the people who looked away while atrocities unfolded in our name. And that question demands an answer not in some distant future, but right now, today, in this moment when the choice between justice and complicity could not be more clear.